Walter Briggs thought he was draining a pond. He was actually draining a secret that had been sitting under 6 feet of muddy water for 41 years, a secret his own father had buried on purpose. By the time the water was gone, Walter wouldn't just find a road. He'd find out that the deed in his fireproof safe, the one he trusted more than anything else he owned, had a hole in it big enough to swallow half his farm. This is the story of the pond that shouldn't have been there, the road that was never supposed to be found, and the carved stone that turned a simple drainage job into the fight of Walter Briggs' life. It started as a maintenance job, nothing more. The old pond behind the north barn had been losing water for 2 summers straight, and Walter, 63 years old, and stubborn about doing things himself, finally called in an excavator crew to drain it fully, clean out the silt, and reline it before the cattle came back through in spring. 2 days, maybe 3, the contractor told him. We pump it out, scrape the bottom, you'll have a prettier pond than your granddad ever had. Walter believed him, why wouldn't he? He'd lived on this property his whole life. 210 acres deeded to his father in 1968, deeded to Walter in 1994 after his father passed. He knew every fence line, every low spot that flooded in April, every place the deer bedded down in November. Or so he thought. The pumps ran for a day and a half. By the second afternoon, the water was low enough that the excavator operator, a young guy named Dale, climbed down into the mud to check the bottom before scraping it flat. He didn't call Walter right away. He just stood there for a long moment, boots sinking into the muck, staring at something that didn't belong. When Walter finally walked down to see what the holdup was, Dale pointed at a long, straight strip running through the center of the drained pond bed. It wasn't a natural feature. Natural silt doesn't run in a perfectly straight line for 60 feet. This did. Underneath a thin crust of dried mud was gravel. Packed, graded gravel, the kind you'd use to build a road bed, not a farm lane, not a cow path, but something engineered. And running along both edges of the gravel strip, half buried and coated in algae, were flat fieldstones, spaced with a precision that looked almost ceremonial. That's not drainage rock, Dale said. That's a road, Mr. Briggs. Somebody built a road right through the bottom of your pond. Walter laughed it off at first. Maybe it's just old fill. My daddy used to dump rock in here to slow the erosion. But Dale had seen enough construction sites to know graded fill from a road bed, and this was a road bed. It ran dead straight toward the property's south fence line, and dead straight toward Walter's own front gate in the other direction. That night, Walter couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the pond. His father had built that pond sometime in the early 1970s, not long after buying the land. Why would anyone flood a perfectly good road, unless the point wasn't to make a pond? The point was to make the road disappear. Walter mentioned the discovery the next morning to the only man on the county line older than the farm itself. Earl Whitfield, 84 years old, Walter's neighbor since before Walter was born, and the closest thing the area had to a living archive. Earl didn't seem surprised. That was the first sign something was wrong. You found the old Sutter Road, Earl said, not as a question but as a statement, like he'd been waiting years for someone to say it out loud. The old what? Earl invited Walter into his front room and pulled a battered wooden box down from a closet shelf. The kind of box that hadn't been opened in a decade, judging by the dust. Inside were folded county plat maps, some hand-drawn, some official surveys stamped by the county assessor's office going back to the 1940s. He spread one particular map across the kitchen table. It was a 1952 county road survey, faded but legible, showing a public access road labeled Sutter Corridor, running from the county highway, cutting straight across what was now Walter's property, and connecting to a second parcel on the far side, land that back then belonged to a family named Larkin. Walter stared at the map. The road on the paper ran in the exact same line as the gravel bed in his drained pond. Not close. Exact. That road was a legal right-of-way, Earl said. Public access for the Larkin family to reach the county highway without going around the long way through the hills. Been there since before either of our daddies bought their land. So what happened to it? Earl hesitated, and that hesitation told Walter more than any answer could have. Your daddy and the Larkins didn't get along. There was a falling out, property line dispute, bad blood. I don't rightly know all of it, I was overseas at the time. But not long after, the Larkins sold up and moved off, and somewhere in there that pond appeared right on top of the road. Walter felt something cold settle in his stomach. You're saying my father buried a public road on purpose? Earl folded the map back up slowly. I'm saying I always wondered why a healthy family would sell good land and leave in the middle of the night. And I'm saying that road on my map runs right through your pond, stone for stone. Walter drove home that evening with more questions than he'd had in his entire adult life on that land. If Earl's map was accurate, if that road really had been a legal right-of-way and not just an old farm track, then somewhere in the county archives there might be a record of it. And if there was a record, it meant the road had never actually been legally closed. It had only been hidden. Walter called his lawyer the next morning. Deborah Voss had handled his father's estate years earlier and knew the property almost as well as he did. I need you to look at something, Walter told her over the phone, trying to keep his voice level. There might be an old road buried on my land, a real one, county recorded. There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause a lawyer gives when she's already recalculating how complicated a case just became. Walter, if there's an unresolved public right-of-way crossing your parcel, that's not a small thing, Deborah said. That could affect your title, your insurance, even your ability to sell down the line. I need to see everything, your deed, your father's original purchase documents, any surveys you've got. Deborah drove out that afternoon. She stood at the edge of the drain pond in her office clothes and dress shoes, staring at the exposed gravel strip like it was a crime scene, which, in a legal sense, it might as well have been. Who else knows about this? She asked. Just my neighbor Earl and the excavator crew. Keep it that way for now, Deborah said. Before this goes any further, I need you to understand something. If this road was a legally established public or shared right-of-way, and it was never formally vacated through the county, meaning nobody filed the paperwork to legally close it, then technically it may still exist. On paper. Whether or not there's a pond sitting on top of it. That doesn't make sense. It's my land. I have a deed. A deed describes ownership, Deborah said carefully. It doesn't automatically erase an easement or a right-of-way that predates it. If your father never filed a road vacation with the county, and the Larkins or their heirs never released their access rights, that corridor could still be legally active, buried or not. Walter felt the ground shift under him, and not just because he was standing on the soft mud of a drain pond. So somebody could still have the right to drive through my property. Deborah didn't answer right away. She was looking at the gravel roadbed, tracing its line with her eyes toward the front gate. Let's hope it's not that simple, she finally said, because if it is, this isn't just about an old road anymore. This is about who actually owns the ground your house is sitting on. 2 days later, the excavator crew found the culvert. It was buried at the low end of the drain pond, right where the old road bed disappeared under an earthen berm that Walter had always assumed was just a natural rise in the land. It wasn't natural. It was a man-made embankment, packed dirt over a corrugated metal culvert pipe wide enough for Dale to crawl into on his hands and knees. "Mr. Briggs, you need to see this," Dale called out, his voice echoing strangely from inside the pipe. Walter and Deborah arrived within the hour. The culvert ran roughly 40 feet under the berm, connecting the road bed on the pond side to a continuation of the gravel road on the other side, a stretch that ran directly under Walter's own front gate and out toward the county highway. In other words, the road hadn't just crossed his pond. It had been engineered deliberately to keep flowing underground and re-emerge exactly where Walter's driveway now sat, before continuing to the public road out front. Somebody didn't just want to hide this road, Deborah said, crouching at the culvert mouth. Somebody wanted to preserve it. You don't build a 40-foot culvert under a pond if your goal is just to bury a road and forget about it. You build a culvert like this if you want the road to survive underneath, intact, in case anyone ever needed to prove it was still there. Walter didn't understand. Why would my father protect a road he was trying to hide? Maybe he wasn't hiding it from the county, Deborah said slowly. Maybe he was hiding it from someone else, and leaving himself or somebody a way to prove later that it never actually disappeared. Inside the culvert, wedged near the far opening, Dale found something metal half buried in decades of silt. He pulled it free and handed it up to Walter. It was an old surveyor's stake, corroded but still legible, stamped with a set of initials and a date, LRS. 1971, LRS. Walter didn't recognize the initials, but Earl might. And if this stake had been placed the same year the pond was built, it meant somebody had been out here marking this exact spot right around the time Walter's father supposedly flooded the road out of existence. The culvert wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident of old farm construction. It was evidence, deliberately preserved by someone who wanted this road to be found again someday by someone. Earl came out to the property the following morning at Walter's request to look at the surveyor's stake. But it wasn't the stake that stopped him cold. It was one of the flat field stones lining the exposed road bed, the same stones Walter had assumed were just decorative edging or erosion control or nothing at all. Earl knelt down beside one particular stone near the culvert mouth, brushed away the dried algae with his sleeve, and went completely silent. "Earl?" Walter asked. "What is it?" Earl didn't answer right away. He just kept staring at the stone's surface, where faint but unmistakable letters had been carved into the rock by hand decades ago, weathered but still readable if you knew to look. LWHITFILD, Rite of Passage Preserved, 1971. Walter felt the world tilt sideways. "Earl," he said slowly, "why is your family's name carved into a stone on my property?" Earl sat back on his heels in the mud, and for the first time since Walter had known him, the old man looked genuinely shaken. "That's not my stone," Earl said quietly. "That's my father's handwriting. My father was L. Whitfield, Lawrence Whitfield. He surveyed this land for the county back in the 70s before he retired. If his initials are on that stake and his name's carved into that stone." He trailed off, running his thumb over the carved letters like he was reading Braille. "He wasn't just mapping this road," Earl said. "He was documenting it on purpose, right before it disappeared." Deborah, who had arrived minutes earlier, crouched next to the stone and photographed it from every angle. "This changes everything," she said. This isn't just an old farm road that happened to get flooded by accident. Somebody, a licensed county surveyor by the sound of it, deliberately marked and preserved evidence of this right-of-way at the exact moment it was being buried. That's not neglect. That's not an accident of history. Then what is it? Walter asked, though some part of him already dreaded the answer. Deborah stood up, brushing mud from her knees, her expression grim. That's someone making sure the truth couldn't be erased, she said, even if the road itself was. For the first time since the pond had started draining, Walter understood that this wasn't a story about an old forgotten path. It was a story about someone, maybe Earl's father, maybe someone else entirely, who had known exactly what was happening back in 1971 and had gone out of their way to leave proof. Proof for someone who wasn't born yet. Proof possibly for Walter himself. Deborah spent the next several days going through every document in Walter's fireproof safe. His father's original 1968 purchase agreement, the 1994 inheritance deed, old tax records, even a stack of yellowed correspondence Walter had never bothered to read closely because it seemed like ordinary farm business. It wasn't ordinary. Buried in a folder labeled simply Property, Misc, Deborah found a 1972 letter from the county assessor's office addressed to Walter's father. It referenced a pending road vacation review for a corridor identified only as Parcel Access Route 14, requesting additional documentation before the county would formally close the right-of-way. There was no reply in the file, no follow-up letter, no stamped confirmation that the vacation had ever been completed. Walter, Deborah said, spreading the documents across his kitchen table, your father started the legal process to close this road. But as far as I can find in your own records, he never finished it. So the road really was never officially closed. Not according to what you have here, Deborah said. And that letter isn't the only thing. Look at this. She pulled out Walter's own 1994 inheritance deed, the document that had passed the property from his father to him after his father's death. Buried in the legal description, in dense surveyor's language Walter had skimmed past 100 times without understanding, was a clause referencing an existing recorded easement, location, and status unconfirmed. Walter had signed documents referencing that clause for years, on his homeowner's insurance renewal, on a refinance application 8 years ago, even on the paperwork when he tried to subdivide off 10 acres for his daughter's house that never got built. Every single time, the clause had been sitting right there in black and white, and every single time nobody, not Walter, not the bank, not the title company, had bothered to chase down what it actually meant. It was never hidden, Deborah said quietly. It was sitting in your own paperwork the whole time. Nobody ever asked what it referred to until now. Walter sat down heavily at the table, staring at his father's unfinished 1972 letter. He tried to close it and just stopped, Walter said. Why would he stop? Deborah didn't have an answer yet, but she had a theory and it was starting to worry her. Maybe, she said, somebody stopped him. 11 days after the pond was drained, a certified letter arrived at Walter's mailbox, stamped with the seal of the county recorder's office. Walter's hands weren't quite steady when he opened it. The letter stated that the county had received an inquiry regarding Parcel Access Route 14, referencing the same unresolved corridor from his father's 1972 letter, and that the matter had been formally reopened for review following a citizen request for records. A citizen request. Someone else had gone to the county and asked about this road before Walter had even finished draining his pond. Who else could have known? Walter asked Deborah over the phone, his voice tight. That's exactly what I want to find out, Deborah said. Citizen requests for old road records are public information, but the requester's name isn't always released right away. I'm filing to find out who submitted it. 2 days later, she had an answer, and it hit Walter harder than he expected. The request had been filed by a woman named Carol Larkin Hayes, the granddaughter of the very Larkin family whose access road had vanished under Walter's pond more than 50 years earlier. She's been trying to trace her family's old property records for months, Deborah told Walter. Genealogy research, from what I can tell, nothing to do with your pond specifically. She had no idea the road had just been physically uncovered. But once she filed that inquiry, it triggered an automatic review on the county's end, and that review is now active whether any of us wanted it or not. Walter felt like the ground he'd farmed his whole life was quietly rearranging itself beneath his boots. So now what? Now the county sends a survey team to verify the corridor's historical boundaries and legal status, Deborah said. And Walter, I have to be honest with you. If this road is confirmed as a valid, never-vacated right-of-way, it doesn't matter that your father drained a pond over it 50 years ago. Legally, it may never have stopped existing, which means it could still run through your property today, gate to gate, whether you like it or not. While the county prepared its formal review, Walter and Earl decided to do their own investigating. If the road really did continue past Walter's gate, out toward the old Larkin property, they wanted to see it with their own eyes before any survey crew showed up. Earl's old plat map showed the corridor continuing roughly a quarter mile past Walter's front gate. Crossing a strip of land that had changed hands 3 times since the Larkins sold up in the early 70s, currently owned by an absentee landholder who used it for nothing but hay leasing. Walking the line with a handheld GPS loaded with coordinates from Earl's map, the two men pushed through overgrown brush and a stretch of scrubby second-growth timber that clearly hadn't been cleared in decades. And there, buried under years of leaf litter and collapsed fencing, they found it. A second stretch of the same graded gravel roadbed, running in a dead straight line exactly where the map predicted, terminating at a rusted iron gate hinge bolted into an old stone gatepost. Carved into the gatepost, weathered nearly smooth but still visible in the low afternoon light, were more initials, the same LRS they'd found on the surveyor's stake in the culvert. "Your father was thorough," Walter murmured. Earl ran his hand along the old stone. "He wasn't just surveying a road, Walter. He was building a paper trail that would outlive him, markers at both ends, a stake in the culvert, a carved stone at the burial point, this gatepost. He wanted anybody who ever came looking to be able to follow it start to finish. But why go through all that trouble instead of just stopping whatever was happening?" Earl's face tightened. Maybe he couldn't stop it. Maybe all he could do was make sure nobody could erase it completely. There's a difference between losing a fight and making sure the fight isn't forgotten. That evening, Walter called Deborah with the news. The corridor was intact, start to finish, physically traceable across two separate properties, exactly matching a 54-year-old county survey. Deborah's response was blunt. "Walter, I need you to prepare yourself. This isn't looking like a technicality anymore. This is looking like a fully documented, never vacated public right-of-way that happens to run directly through the middle of your property, and directly under your own front gate." Walter had planned to finish relining the pond that week, patch the gravel road bed over, and move on with his life. The state had other plans. A representative from the State Department of Transportation's Local Roads Division arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning, accompanied by two surveyors and a stack of official paperwork. They'd been alerted by the county's active review of parcel access Route 14, and once state records had been cross-checked, something even bigger had turned up. The corridor wasn't just an old private right-of-way between two farms. It had, at one point in the 1950s, been designated as part of a rural connector route eligible for county maintenance funding, meaning it may have once carried a public, not merely private, legal status. If that designation was never formally revoked, the state representative told Walter, standing at the edge of the half-drained pond with a clipboard in hand, then this corridor could fall under state right-of-way protections, not just county ones. Which means, effective immediately, we're asking you to halt any further construction, filling, or alteration to this road bed until our review is complete. Walter watched, stunned, as his excavator crew on his land, packed up their equipment and left under the state's direction. Bright orange survey flags went up along both sides of the exposed gravel, planted every 10 feet, marking a corridor that ran straight through his pond, his driveway, and out his front gate. "You're telling me I can't even fix my own pond," Walter said. "I'm telling you," the representative said carefully, "that until we determine the legal status of this corridor, you can't alter, block, or obstruct it in any way. If it turns out to be a protected right-of-way, filling it back in without authorization could be treated as an illegal obstruction of a public corridor. I know that's not what you want to hear." Walter stood at the edge of his own pond, staring at a line of orange flags cutting his property in half, and understood for the first time that this was no longer his decision to make. His pond, his gate, his driveway. And none of it, for the moment, was entirely his to control. The formal county hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, giving Deborah time to dig through the deepest layer of records yet. The original 1950s County Road Commission minutes, archived on microfilm in the basement of the county courthouse. What she found there was the piece that tied everything together. In 1958, the County Road Commission had formally approved Access Route 14 as a maintained connector road linking the Larkin family's landlocked parcel to the county highway, a legal necessity at the time, since the Larkin property had no other road frontage. The road was built with partial county funding and officially logged in the Road Commission's minutes as a public access corridor. In 1971, a request to vacate the road appeared in the Commission's records, filed not by the Larkins, but by Walter's father. The request cited mutual agreement between both landowners to close the corridor and reroute Larkin access via a different route. But there in the county archive was the detail that changed the entire case. Attached to that 1971 vacation request was a required signature line for the Larkin family, acknowledging their consent to give up their legal access rights. The line was blank, unsigned. The vacation request had been filed. It had never been approved, because state and county rules at the time required consent from every party with an active interest in the right-of-way, and the Larkins, according to the record, had never signed off. "Your father tried to close this road," Deborah told Walter, laying the microfilm printout on the table between them. "But the Larkin family never agreed. Without their signature, the county never had the legal authority to approve the vacation." Which means on paper, this corridor has remained an active, legally protected right-of-way for the last 54 years, even while it sat at the bottom of your pond. Walter stared at the blank signature line like it was a verdict. So it's real, he said quietly. All of it, the road never actually went away. No, Deborah said, it just went underwater. The county hearing confirmed what Deborah had already found in the archives. Parcel access Route 14 was and had legally remained an active right-of-way, improperly and incompletely vacated in 1971. The corridor was ordered restored to protected status, meaning it could not be filled, blocked, built over, or obstructed without a formal, fully consented vacation process. One that would now require the participation of every legal heir with a documented interest in the original right-of-way, including Carol Larkin Hayes and her extended family. For Walter, the practical consequences landed hard and fast. His title insurance company, once informed of the active, unresolved easement crossing the property, flagged his policy for review. The clean title Walter had operated under for 30 years, the assumption that his ownership was simple, complete, and unencumbered, turned out to have never been accurate at all. A previously undisclosed right-of-way had been sitting in the legal description of his land the entire time, buried under mud, silence, and one incomplete piece of paperwork from 1971. What does this actually mean for me? Walter asked Deborah, sitting across from her in the same kitchen where this had all started weeks earlier. It means you still own the land, Deborah said. Nobody's taking your farm. But it means the Larkin descendants, or their designated agents, have a legally protected right to use that corridor for access if they choose to formalize it. It means any future sale of your property has to disclose this easement. And it means the pond, as it existed for 50 years, was technically sitting on top of a road you didn't have full legal authority to bury in the first place. Walter thought about his father, a man he'd always believed to be careful, meticulous, a man who didn't leave loose ends. And yet here it was, one unsigned line on one piece of paper, sitting quietly in a county archive for over half a century, waiting for a pond to lose its water and a road to lose its cover. Why didn't he just get the Larkins to sign? Walter asked, why leave it like this? Nobody had a certain answer. But Earl, when Walter asked him the same question days later, offered the only theory that made emotional sense of everything they'd found: the carved stone, the culvert, the surveyor's stake, all of it. Maybe your father wanted to bury the fight, Earl said, but couldn't bring himself to erase the truth completely. Some men can live with taking something, not many men can live with lying about it forever. That stone, that culvert, that was your father leaving the door open, even after he shut it. In the months that followed, Walter, Deborah, Carol Larkin Hayes, and county officials worked through a formal resolution. Rather than fully reopening the road for regular use, something none of the current landowners particularly wanted, the parties agreed to a documented, limited-access easement, legal recognition that the corridor existed, paired with an agreement that it would remain unused unless a genuine access need ever arose again. The pond itself was rebuilt, smaller this time, carefully positioned to avoid the protected corridor entirely. The exposed gravel road bed was left largely undisturbed, marked now with official county boundary stakes instead of buried under water and silence. Carol Larkin Hayes visited the property once the matter was settled, walking the old road bed with Walter and Earl at her side. She'd never known her grandfather's family had lost more than just a piece of land back in 1971. They'd lost a right quietly, without ever signing away their consent, and had spent 54 years not knowing the door had technically never closed. I didn't come here looking for a road, she told Walter, standing near the old carved stone. I was just trying to find out where my family used to live. I never expected the ground to still be arguing about it. Walter thought about that a long time after she left. He thought about how close the whole truth had come to staying buried forever, one dry summer away from never being drained, one contractor's schedule away from never being noticed. One silt-covered gravel strip away from disappearing into county history, the same way it had disappeared from Walter's own understanding of his land. He thought about his father, a man who had made a choice he clearly wasn't proud enough of to finish, but wasn't willing to hide completely either. A man who buried a road and, in doing so without meaning to, planted the very evidence that would one day undo the burial. Standing at the edge of his rebuilt pond, watching the new water settle over ground that no longer hid anything, Walter finally understood what Earl had been trying to tell him from the very first day. The pond had never really been about mud or water or a maintenance job gone strange. It had been about a road nobody was supposed to remember, carrying a truth that refused for 54 years to stay drowned.